The Revenue Watch Institute is a nonprofit organization that is devoted to promoting the transparent, accountable, and successful management of oil, gas, and mining resources in resource-rich countries. We've been very active in the campaign to promote more disclosure by extractive companies, among other things. But we work directly in many resource-dependent countries. We advise on contract negotiation, on tax structures for minerals concessions, and we work particularly with civil society activists in resource-rich countries. In terms of the subject at hand, I think Norwegians understand full well the value of transparency, that the availability of public information is essential for a successful state, essential for efficient markets. And investor interest in the issues around revenue and other disclosure by extractive companies is essential, because in the end it's the investors that companies and even governments listen to. Civil society activists can do a lot, but investor support on these critical issues is absolutely essential. And as the preceding speaker said, investors have a strong self-interest in disclosure of information that leads to both greater company efficiency and a more stable investor environment. We have seen there's so many examples, unfortunately, too many examples where opacity and secrecy around oil, gas, and mining resource management feeds corruption, feeds mismanagement and inefficiency, and sometimes leads and feeds conflict. The U.S. Congress has taken an important step to do something about this through the adoption of the Dodd-Frank disclosure legislation that I'm sure others have described earlier. It is an important piece of the puzzle that builds on the very significant accomplishments of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the voluntary initiative that Norway hosts and that Norway has indeed implemented, setting a very good example. As the other speaker said, it's not just a matter of supporting and assisting the interests of citizens in resource-rich countries, but also of protecting investor interests. Corruption and mismanagement can lead to huge costs for companies. There's reputation risk, and more importantly, there's risk to enormous sunk capital. One has seen, for example, Shell being the most notorious example, has suffered severe disruptions of its production in African countries because of the unstable political climate. One notes that Statoil so far does not seem to have suffered the same fate in its investments, partly because it is certainly not perfect, but Statoil operates, thanks to Norwegian law, under a very different transparency regime, and is required to disclose, and does disclose, much more information about what it is doing, what it is paying in individual countries. But there is another aspect to the transparency, not just ensuring that the citizens and investors know what companies are paying in taxes, but also helping countries to assess whether or not they're actually collecting the taxes they should be from their resource wealth. Norway collects roughly, I believe, 82 cents on the dollar for every barrel of oil produced out of its territory. Equatorial Guinea gets about something like 25 or 30 cents on the dollar, and there are other countries where it's much lower. And in mining, countries receive there are cases where countries have been exporting massive amounts of gold and other valuable minerals and receiving virtually no tax revenue whatsoever. And that's because of the reporting system and the governance of the extractive sector in that country and externally from the home regulators allow companies to manipulate their operations through transfer pricing and misreporting and inflating costs and so on to avoid any, and use of tax havens, which are rampant around the world, to manipulate the books so they don't pay any tax, and particularly don't pay any tax in the country that's generating and owns the resource they are developing and exporting. From an investor standpoint, there's some very interesting research by several different research products in the U.S. which show that when companies disclose information on a geographic basis, the profitability of particularly foreign operations rises. In the U.S., there was a change in the accounting law that shifted from a mandatory disclosure by geographic segment, reporting by geographic segment, to voluntary. And the companies that stopped reporting by geographic segment also had a decline in the profitability of their overseas operations. Not the sales, not the size. What the researchers explored was the notion that managers build empires that are not necessarily profitable and yield returns to the investors, but yield benefits for the managers. And the less geographic reporting you have, the harder it is for investors to discern that that's what's going on. So there's a very direct and concrete investor interest in these. And consequently, for example, a group of investors in the U.S. got together in December of 2010 and issued a statement, a so-called New Haven Declaration, where they called for country-by-country disclosure of production and turnover, profit and losses, sales, intragroup trade and financing volumes, capital and staffing information, taxes owed, paid, and liabilities remaining. So a more complete picture will benefit both the country and the investor. At the moment, there's a big debate in the EU, in Europe, about following the U.S. example of adopting disclosure requirements for extractive companies, country by country and project by project reporting, which is what the Dodd-Frank legislation requires. It would be extremely valuable and very important for Norway to lead the way. Norway's stock market is not large, but Norway knows how to regulate and require disclosure from extractive industries. Norway has a huge pool of investors, many of whom are represented here. And Norway has the freedom to act relatively more quickly than the EU process requires, given that it is a country process. And if Norway moves ahead, it can help to set the template for what the EU will do. I think it's in everyone's interest that we harmonize the regulation. It's obviously, it will be very challenging for companies to have to report one way in the US, another way in Europe. But we know, and we have seen in the struggle over the Securities and Exchange regulations to implement the Dodd-Frank legislation, that there is an enormous pushback and enormous resistance from particularly the oil industry, to having full disclosure. And there will be enormous pressure in the EU process to water down what was done by the US. And I think that given Norway's exemplary regulation of the extractive industry and its deep experience in its own oil sector and its deep understanding of what it means to a country to have a successful oil industry, that Norway, by adopting disclosure regulation that may not water down Dodd-Frank but indeed strengthen it, could have an enormous influence on the next stage. We are moving unevenly, but we are moving now, I think, increasingly rapidly toward a global standard for disclosure around extractive industry operations. And Norway could play a very significant role in setting the bar where it should be set, so that there is a standard that is meaningful, that is robust, that is high, and that is one that fits with the oil and mining sectors, but also meets the needs of investors and meets the needs of citizens. And the Norwegian influence can be significant not just in Europe, but also in the G20. It is obviously very important to bring some of the big investing and countries that are not just home to significant operating companies like Brazil with Petrobras, but also big investors like and importers of these commodities like China and India, to bring them on board and bring them into the dialogue of high standards for their companies and for their investment practices. Developing countries look to Norway. They don't look to the US as an example. They don't look to the Netherlands as an example of successful oil sector management. They look to Norway. And Norway's Oil for Development program, I think, has been one of the most innovative foreign aid technical assistance programs undertaken by any country. Norway has enormous credibility in the developing world. And if Norway sets a standard and adopts a new law and is outspoken in its leadership and active with emerging market economies, that will have an influence on their thinking and on their approach to these issues. Thank you very much.